we're back with another episode of Gladio Free Europe. I am Russian Sam, joined as always by my co-host Liam.
Hey.
And Liam, it's Thanksgiving. As I understand it, you went back to visit your family.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Thanksgiving. It's all about family, getting together, thinking about the past, about your relatives.
Yeah, well, did you ever talk about your ancestors during this Hello Thanksgiving? Like, if I'm not mistaken, your family goes back to, in America, a very long way, right?
Yeah, well, I did get an Ancestry.com subscription as a gift. So I've been, going up in the family tree, trying to see who I can find. And there's a lot more people in general up there than you might think. Everyone has a lot of ancestors.
Yeah, so I'm guessing that you shared all of your genealogical research with your family when you came back?
Yeah, I did. And one reaction is that people are often really surprised. When a lot of people do these tests, they get very excited to find out that, like, oh, I'm descended from Mark Twain. I'm descended from, Charles V of Spain or whatever. Of course, obviously, that stuff, like, on one hand, that stuff is meaningless. Like, who your ancestors are has no bearing on your worth, on who you are as a person. On the other hand, though, that kind of descent is not as rare as people might think. Literally everybody on Earth is descended from royalty when they go back far enough. But despite that, questions about ancestry and genealogy have been really important to people from the earliest period of recorded history, basically to the present, with, the rise of consumer DNA testing and with the rise of these kinds of, like, open-sourced family tree websites. And that's why I was thinking that for this episode, we can kind of dive into earlier, especially medieval conceptions of genealogy and ancestry, both the genealogies of individual peoples like kings and heroes and priests, as well as the ancestries of entire nations. And it's the second group which has a lot more interesting political implications than you might expect.
Yeah, for sure. This is something that people like me generally don't think that much about because I try not to operate in like a nationalist frame of reference.
Of course.
But it is very important for some people.
Yeah.
And as we're about to find out, historically, it was also very important for ruling classes all over the world to establish their legitimacy or their right to rule through
Absolutely.
the fact that like 20 generations ago, they were related to some guy who was great, allegedly.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm going to say right off the bat, I am super skeptical about these kinds of genealogies. Obviously, many of these are not true. Half of them involve monsters, up in the family tree.
Well, when it comes to royalty, I'm willing to believe the monster claims.
All right, so I guess what I should really say is I'm cynical because I do think that many of these kinds of claims started as deliberate, basically power grabs. Like if one king could say he was descended from another king 500 years before, that makes his claim to the throne more legitimate. So I think that most of these genealogies that we're about to talk about, which is going to be the bulk of this episode, I think they were constructed for cynical reasons. But at the same time, what's really interesting is that even if that's why these genealogies were constructed, people believed them. And many people really did buy into these theories that have been basically forgotten today and often seem incredibly outlandish, but have some really interesting and oftentimes really terrifying implications on the ways that early modern and even modern peoples understood the world.
Yeah, and as we'll see, these ideas really took on a life of their own in many cases. What was conceived as like a genealogy for a king in like 500 of the Common Era would become basically like the rallying cry of entire nations in the 19th century when nationalism became the driving force of politics.
Exactly. And I found a really great anecdote from the 16th century, which was right at the cusp of these kinds of ancient and medieval royal genealogies turning into early nationalist or even almost proto-racial theories of descent. And this one, which I think is very entertaining, takes us to 1540 in Scotland, when a man named John Faw appeared in the court of King James V, asking for safe travels throughout the country. John Faw was the leader of a group of Romani people who had recently arrived in Scotland from somewhere in the continent, maybe France or Spain. By this point, the Romani had already run into a lot of problems in Europe. Many nations had already become pretty prejudiced toward these newcomers, and they'd even been banned from living in England or Denmark. But Scotland, at this place in time, was pretty different. Romani in 1540 were already widely called gypsies, based on the mistaken belief that they had originated in Egypt. So when the Romani first arrived in the Scottish court, the Scots had already heard these stories of gypsies, Egyptians, or even Little Egyptians. And so when John Faw asked for protection, King James, probably somewhat shockingly to John Faw, enthusiastically agreed. And the king said that John Faw would be recognized as Lord and Earl of Little Egypt. He could travel anywhere in the country with his royal seal. Any Romani who didn't respect Earl John's authority would be considered outlaws. And we aren't exactly sure why King James made this surprising ruling, but one really fun theory is that King James gave protection to these Little Egyptians because, unlike any other kingdom in Europe, the Scots believed that they themselves were also Egyptian.
So you gotta watch out for your own kin, you know?
Exactly, yeah. And this is really fun because, nobody today would think of Scotland as having any kind of remote connection to Egypt, not in language, culture, religion, ancestry. But in the 16th century, that connection was really logical and made more sense to them than really any geographic connection to like the neighboring English or the Welsh. And it really is a crazy story, and I'll get into it in a second, but this story, the reason why they believed the Scots were Egyptians is the perfect kind of skeleton key for understanding early modern and medieval ideas about genealogy. I'm sure John Faw was confused, but he wasn't going to look a gift earldom in the mouth. So we can imagine he listened patiently as King James or one of his courtiers explained that during the time of Moses, the wicked pharaoh had a daughter named Scota. Scota was an Egyptian princess who was engaged to be married to a man from Babylon named Neil. Right? Classic Babylonian name, Neil.
Yeah, if you go to Iraq today, you'll find plenty of Neils. They remembered their heritage.
Yeah. So Neil was a Babylonian whose ancestors were Scythians, and those ancestors traced their ancestry back to Magog and Gomer, who were grandsons of Japheth, one of the biblical sons of Noah. Neil, while living in Babylon, had witnessed the construction and the fall of the Tower of Babel firsthand. Because this gave him an insight into the birth of every human language, this guy Neil spoke all the languages in the world. And that's why he was thought of as this perfect match for Princess Scota, because he could teach her all these languages, he could be a great asset to the court, he had a very impressive pedigree, and so he was invited to come to Egypt. But then one day, pretty shortly after their marriage, Princess Scota was wandering around the Egyptian palace, and she witnessed one of the miracles of Noah. She realized now that she had to abandon her pagan worship of the gods like Anubis and Osiris, and must instead adopt the worship of, the monotheistic god of Judaism and Christianity. So just as Moses began his journey through the desert, Princess Scota took her husband, and they went on their own migration, going the opposite direction. And then Scota took her husband west throughout the Sahara. Eventually they had a son named Goidel, who, after learning all of the 72 languages of the world from his parents, decided to construct the 73rd language, which would be the most beautiful of all of them, and that being the language Gaelic. For 440 years, Goidel and his descendants traveled all across Africa, Asia, and Europe, looking for the best land to settle to. Eventually, they found Ireland and Scotland. Therefore, the king explained to John Faw, the ancestors of the Scots and the Irish were ultimately Egyptians and Scythians, and anybody of Egyptian or Scythian heritage were brethren of the Scots. So again, this is a really crazy story, and I don't think any other European nation claimed that the Romani were their kin because of these kinds of stories. But these kinds of stories were really common during this period. Basically, every Western European nation around 1400 had developed some kind of elaborate national mythos over the past few hundred years. And by this time, the cusp of the early modern period, these kinds of histories were starting to really impact policy for the first time. This was when national identities were first starting to take shape. Every kingdom wanted to figure out who they were and how they should see themselves. And then, due to the rise of the printing press, stories about these legendary mythologies, these, magical progenitors, these ancient heroes, became really widely read. And a lot of these stories eventually slipped into pop culture in ways that some of our listeners might still be familiar with today. None of these stories are remotely true, but here's the thing, they're really fun. These kinds of legends give us a really interesting look into the minds and worldviews of peoples hundreds of years ago, what they thought about themselves, their neighbors, and of course, the past. So in this episode, we are going to look at the origins of the origin story itself to figure out how and why these kinds of really similar narratives became so popular. We're going to run through a few of our favorite national origin myths like this, ones from Sweden, Ireland, England, and Poland. And we're going to explain the ways that these kinds of very goofy stories eventually pretty much became legally sanctioned. And once this happened, as they started to take on a more legally codified and oftentimes pseudoscientific valence, they became a little bit less fun, because then these stories began to justify repression and segregation and everything that we all know and hate from the early modern period up until the present.
Well, I'd say that they already were used to justify those things, just the way that it was done very much differed between how this would have been formulated in the 20th century and, say, the 6th century.
Yeah.
Like, at its core, these are fundamentally exclusionary concepts,
right,
which were largely crafted to create this idea of like a privileged class that has a right to rule over everyone else because reasons.
Right. And that's a really important thing, that some of these stories were broad national origins for every person in a nation, but many of them were specific to the ruling dynasty. And oftentimes they quite literally said that, you know, if this one member of a ruling dynasty is descended from a mermaid, then that means that the mermaid's descendants have strange magical powers that common people can't have. So common people should never consider, you know, holding power over the society. They can never share that magical wisdom.
Yeah, so again, very Targaryen. As you can see, George R.R. Martin did his research. He really grounded himself in the thinking of medieval Europe.
Absolutely,
and to just what an extent he did that, we're about to find out. But before we get to the really fun stuff, I just like to begin by laying out a basic theoretical framework for understanding all of this, because there is actually a lot going on with these kinds of...
And also kind of a geographic caveat. For this episode, we're really only going to be looking at Western Europe, just kind of mostly for the sake of time and because that kind of leads directly to the kind of nationalist ideas we're talking about. But these kinds of ancestral claims, the existence of these legendary progenitors, exist all over the world. Many ethnic groups in the Middle East and Africa claim descent from figures in the Quran. In Central Asia, people often claim descent from specific ancient Turkic heroes.
Or Genghis Khan, for example. That's another very common one. But
yeah, you're right. Most of all, yeah.
This stuff is really kind of a primordial building block of history in a certain way, because like it really makes sense from a certain perspective, because human civilization would have emerged out of what was previously a bunch of small, disparate kin groups. And even as these kin groups gave way to more expansive polities, this mode of thinking would continue to influence how people imagine themselves and their ancestry writ large. So there was a bias towards imagining people as springing from this single great progenitor, many of whom with time would become deified.
And when we said that this stuff goes back to like the beginnings of written history, we meant that literally, because one of the very oldest surviving texts in the world, I think it actually might even be like the 5th oldest really surviving document, is the Egyptian pyramid texts carved around 2400, which makes it slightly older than Stonehenge. And this document suggests that the lineage of all of the pharaohs actually begins in the heavens, with Horus and Osiris.
Yeah, and around the same time, the Sumerians and then the Mesopotamians would also claim similar descents. So, of course, there was Gilgamesh, who was a literal demigod, and then cities like Ashur would claim that, in fact, their entire city had been built by gods. So these kinds of ancient Egyptian and Near Eastern ideas about godliness either spread through the Mediterranean during the Bronze Ages, or at the very least influenced the frameworks of later peoples. So again, jumping over thousands of years of history here, we're going to mostly be looking at two frameworks that were most important in this regard. There's the Greco-Roman framework and the Judeo-Christian framework. And these would intersect very heavily, both because of ancient interactions between these two cultural spheres, as well as the later synthesis that would happen under the auspices of European Christendom. Let's go back all the way to the beginning, that is Genesis. If you're familiar with Genesis, I'm sure that your favorite part is the genealogies. If you're not familiar, here's a taste of Genesis 10, which is basically just like giving an account of who's descended from whom. And the purpose of this passage is to explain the origins of mankind after the Great Flood, which had destroyed humanity in its entirety except for Noah and his family. So all humans who are alive today are therefore descended from Noah's sons.
These are the lines of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. Sons were born to them after the flood. The descendants of Japheth: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. The descendants of Ham: Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Sons were also born to Shem, ancestor of all of the descendants of Eber, and older brother of Japheth. The descendants of Shem are Elam, Ashur, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram.
Yeah, just riveting stuff, right?
Yeah, the begot, all that stuff, yeah.
So the interesting thing about this is that all of these are real peoples or states or places that existed in the world of the Bible.
Yeah, or really, you could say, I would say, in the worldview of the people who wrote the Bible, of, Iron Age Jewish people.
Bronze Age in some cases. This is actually considered to be very old. Yeah, this is like one of the earlier passages of the Bible, if I'm remembering correctly. Okay. It's been a while since I really studied this stuff intensively. But anyway, each one of these nations or peoples bears the. But the interesting thing about this is that many of these people would be claimed as progenitors either by later people themselves or applied to other people by outside observers who were steeped in biblical genealogy at this point. So, for example, Ashkenaz is a pretty famous one because that's where Ashkenazi Jews come from, And in our understanding of it, Ashkenaz is associated with the western parts of Germany, basically. But before that, it was the Scythians. So if you were talking in like the 7th century or something like that, and someone brought up Ashkenaz, they were probably talking about specifically the Scythians and not the Germans. But anyway, there are many more genealogies found throughout the Bible. And if you're interested in that, I'm sure you can find them. I'm sure you can memorize all of these descendant trees if that's your inclination. But all of those would be put to use as well. So that's one piece of the puzzle. All peoples were taken to be the descendants of particular individuals who would cement a nation around them, a process which today we would call ethnogenesis. And biblical genealogy became a sort of skeleton key for a genre of universal history, which would be popular both in Jewish, Christianate, and Islamicate discursive spaces.
Of course, yeah.
Yep. Perhaps the most famous example of this would be the idea that the Jews are the descendants of Isaac, while the Arabs are the descendants of his brother Ishmael.
Right, because was this that Abraham had 2 women, right? He was married to Sarah, who had one son very late, and then he had the handmaiden Rahab, who gave birth to Ishmael.
I think it was Hagar, actually, in this case. But
you're right. Yes, you're right.
But yeah, we'll come back to the Jewish aspect later. But first, let's turn to the more Greco-Roman tradition.
So a lot of people call Herodotus the first ethnographer because his histories really meticulously detailed the many different peoples in the known world. We mentioned Herodotus and some of his stories before in our Dragon episode a couple weeks ago. He's also erroneously been called the first historian, but that's definitely not true, especially if you take a more expansive view of history. But even if you don't, if you're looking at the definition of history as like written historical documents, he was definitely not the first to do that. It's just that his are the first to survive in a complete form. We have fragmentary histories from earlier writers.
Yeah, so as Herodotus saw it, he was trying to write this total history of the world.
Common theme here, yeah.
And so to make sense of this, Herodotus would divide the world into ethne, nations or peoples. This is the root of our word ethnicity as used to this day, and gene, tribes, which could either be a subdivision of ethne or their own thing. And these groups were differentiated by geography, language, culture, economic life, religion, etc. There's a whole lot of stuff. The places where these people lived were named after their inhabitants, and he described something like 50 peoples in all. So he was really a trendsetter in this regard. He would first describe many peoples who would later be elaborated upon by many other writers who, even if they didn't particularly like Herodotus himself, would continue to operate in the categories that he established. And Herodotus, unlike the later Roman writers like Pliny, for example, would base this idea of peoples on self-identification, whereas later historians, thinking in a more imperial mold, tended to lump peoples together. So think of like the Celts, the Germanics, the Scythians, etc. These were very much imperial categories, just these Romans trying to impose their own worldview on all of the disparate peoples of the world to create this like framework that groups them all together based on where they lived rather than their self-identification or their ways of life. At some point, we mentioned that one of the Roman writers, I think it was Tacitus, basically said that Slavs are a type of Scythian because they also like live on their horses and things like that. But the difference is that the Slavs have carts, whereas the Scythians don't. But another difference from Herodotus is that many of these later later writers would be much more intolerant about different peoples. Herodotus himself was something of a cultural relativist, which would cause later writers to derisively call him a philo-barbarian.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's a really famous passage in this regard, which recounts the period when Darius, king of Persia, called Greeks into his court and asked them how much he would have to pay them to make them consume their dead parents' bodies.
Yeah, ritual cannibalism.
And the Greeks, of course, recoiled in disgust, saying that they could never do such a thing. Then he calls forth a group of Indians called Kaliate, whose custom was just that, and asked them how much he would have to pay them to cremate their parents' bodies. And of course, those people reacted the same way. And so Herodotus goes on, so firmly rooted are these beliefs, and it is rightly said in Pindar's poem that custom is lord of all. So Herodotus, he didn't really see it, like he saw his duty as recording rather than casting judgment.
He was an open-minded guy. But the Romans, a very different kind of attitude.
Yeah, Patrick Geary points out that the Romans developed something akin to a law of conservation of peoples, which is to say that the existence of peoples was not socially contingent, but an eternal truth. Here's a quote from Geary's Myth of Nations, which is something that I based this section very heavily on. No people ever disappeared. No trait ever changed. At best, an old people might acquire a new name and novel, even contradictory customs and characteristics, but the prospective Roman could still recognize them for what they are. Such people were, in a sense, more part of the natural world than the historical world. This kind of thinking would reemerge in the modern day, really. Nationalists will, even today, in fact, sometimes will insist that there's something essentially Frankish or Gaulish about the people of France today, or that Hungarians are somehow essentially Hunnish, that the Jews of today are largely the same as the Judeans of the 8th century before the Common Era.
Yeah. And what I think is especially funny given like modern application of this kind of, basically pseudo-history is that the Romans themselves had, when they were categorizing peoples, they lumped peoples together that would not be lumped together today, I feel like. Like you mentioned how they thought that Scythians, who were Iranic speaking, like Persians, they had this inherent connection to Slavs. And the Byzantines later believed that Gothic peoples, who spoke a Germanic language, were also basically a type of Scythian.
Yeah, like a lot of this was very much vibes based, and this was a time when you couldn't just like get on Google and find out what a Scythian is.
Totally.
So if you read like a book by Jordanus or someone like that who tells you that Goths are descended from so-and-so god, then who are you to question it? He's the smart guy who wrote the book. You're just, there to consume that knowledge. Getting back to the question of like national essences, I feel like there's a kernel of truth to this kind of stuff in many cases. Mm-hmm. So the languages that we speak today will preserve elements of millennia past. Cultural markers can often be traced very far into the past as well.
Right.
But as we're going to see through this episode, the past very much is a foreign country, and the ancestral claims of today's nations would seem jarring to a contemporary observer. And even terms that continue to be in use today often will have very different meanings from those that were ascribed to them by authors in like the 7th century.
Definitely. And the kinds of things that anthropologists today tend to focus on as important or at least identifiable markers of shared cultural descent, like things like language, wouldn't necessarily have been the most important aspect of culture and identity to the peoples that we're talking about.
Yeah, but let's return to the Romans. With time, they began to acquire sort of a dichotomy between civilized and barbarian worlds. There was the world of the populus Romanus and that of the gentes.
Like the common people.
Well, no, tribes, essentially. It's the same name as Herodotus's genes, just in the Roman form.
Yeah.
And Geary calls the populus Romanus a constitutional people, so-called, who were bound together by law and political life and who were subject to historical forces, whereas the gentes were biological peoples who were bound together primarily by geography and kinship and who were basically outside of history. Again, part of the natural world.
Yeah, fauna.
So individuals and even entire groups of gentes could join the populus Romanus by adopting the Roman way of life and proving their loyalty, although it often wasn't very easy. The Roman Republic, in fact, had an entire civil war after the peoples of Italy rose up to protest their lack of citizenship. This was the Social War, I believe.
Yeah.
And just speaking to the way that people tend to come up with very similar ideas, even if they're literally thousands of miles apart from each other and don't really know of each other's existence, the Chinese had a very similar view of describing things. There was the dichotomy between the Hua, that is people who have a Chinese way of life, and the Yi, the barbarians. And if the Yi were to acculturate to proper civilized so-called customs, then there's nothing really stopping them from becoming a Hua. But in any case, authors like Livy recognized that Romans weren't really an eternal constant, that Romulus had created Romans from many disparate elements, and the Romans themselves would continue to have gentes, even if they were all part of the populus Romanus. So both the patricians and plebeians would have their own gens, kin group, basically, with patricians claiming an illustrious descent from the founders of Rome. So you're probably familiar with some of these families, like the Claudians and the Julians.
And of course, the Judeo-Claudians.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, these people all have very interesting origins. Like the Julians, I believe, claim that they were descended from a Sabine prince who decided to defect to Rome with his armies and save the city in this way. But yeah, they all have like these very interesting stories. Some of them are around, some of them have been lost to time. But basically the patricians, they were supposed to be descended from people that Romulus had appointed to the Roman Senate, which is a great time to ask whether Romulus existed as a historical figure in the first place. We don't really know that. It's hard to tell, honestly, which just goes to show how many of these ancestral claims are probably very spurious. But I mean, we just don't know, frankly. But let's assume that this is true for a second, just for the sake of the narrative.
Yeah.
And even with all this bluster about barbarians being outside of history because their societies were supposedly primarily based around kinship rather than laws, Romans still placed great value in lineages, as we'll see. The centrality of law to the formation of peoples would rub off on many people with whom the Romans would come into contact. So Caesar famously noticed that the Gauls who neighbored Rome were becoming acculturated to Roman life, while those who were...
Yeah, the Galla Togata, he called them, the toga wearers.
Yeah, exactly. While those who were further away from the frontiers would become increasingly barbarian, which isn't to say that they couldn't be acculturated. In fact, that's what Caesar was trying to do precisely by capturing all of these territories. Like, basically, there was this idea that the populus Romanus could indeed expand. It wasn't just a matter of biological descent. In fact, famously, Augustus would get before the Roman Senate and argue for granting Gauls citizenship by saying that his own ancestors had been from outside of Rome, and now he wouldn't have called himself the emperor at that point, I don't think, but now he's a great man, and clearly, if someone like him could become a Roman, then anyone from any of these foreign peoples could as well if they were of the right kind.
Right. And basically, to make a long story short, due to the influence of Roman law and Roman philosophy, Roman conceptions of ethnicity would become very widespread across post-Roman Europe. After the 5th century, once the Western Roman Empire no longer exists, the kingdoms that replace it would be reading these same kinds of texts. And this kind of attitude about gentes would basically seep into the common population in places even like Ireland and Germany that had not much, if any, Roman presence at all.
Yeah, for sure. But let's get back to Judaism for a second and Christianity as well, because this was really, like, these two religions, they come from common sources, so you can't really talk about one without talking about the other. But
right, and also the biblical part is also a huge part of every individual genealogy. Whenever European monarchs were saying who they were descended from, they basically always started with the Bible.
Yeah. And of course, the people of Judea weren't hermetically sealed away from the world at large, right? Even centuries before Judea became part of the Roman Empire, the land was often controlled directly by Hellenistic states.
Yeah, very strong Greek influence for centuries.
And in the times when they weren't, they were still operating in conversation with the Greek world and philosophy and all that entailed. Mm-hmm. So, case in point, by the 3rd century before the Common Era, the Tanakh would be translated into Greek. This would be called the Septuagint.
Yeah, because I believe that the name means 70, right? Because 70 translators were needed to translate such a huge book.
Yes, exactly. Like, the story is that they got like 8 guys from each of the 12 tribes. If my math is off, I'm sorry. Now, really, not my...
Yeah, we are. This is a very humanities-pilled podcast.
Yeah, and basically the idea was that like every one of these people were locked into a room to write their own translation, and then when they came out, miraculously they
compared.
Yeah, they compared them, and they had all written the identical translation. I'm skeptical, but I mean, like the reason why the Septuagint needed to be created in the first place was because so many Jews were no longer able to understand the Bible in the original language, which just goes to show how much influence there was on these Jewish peoples. And this Greco-Roman influence would also have an influence on the ways that the Jews conceptualized both themselves and others. So the notion of constitutional peoples in Gary's lingo took hold. Thus, goyim, or nations, became a term that was associated with Gentiles in particular, whereas previously goy just meant nation, and the term would often be applied to the Jewish people as well. So in Genesis 12, for example, God promises Abraham that his descendants would be a great nation, a goy gadol. In Deuteronomy 4, God tells the Israelites that if they observe his laws and commandments, they will be looked upon by the other peoples, the Amim, as a goy gadol, etc., etc. But like the meaning would drift quite a bit. Mm-hmm. And in fact, with Greco-Roman influence, the Jews became an Am, that is a people, rather than a goy.
Huh.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting case of influence to be found in even later texts in the Talmudic period. So this would have been like from 200 to 400 of the Common Era, where the idea of the Am Ha'aretz, like the people of the land, literally shifted from the previous meaning of people who work the land to an ignoramus, basically.
Oh.
And if you're familiar with Latin etymology slightly, you'll know that the word pagan has the exact same origins as like...
Yeah, country dweller. Paganus.
Yeah, exactly. So that just goes to show that constant conversation between these two cultural spheres.
And another one, I'll just jump on that. So today, of course, the word goy means someone who is not Jewish, but the English translation of that word, Gentile, I'm positive that comes from the Latin gentes. So it's a word that meant nation, essentially, but that takes on this different meaning within Judaism.
Yeah, exactly. And here we should underline that this was not really a biological distinction. Jews weren't taken to be special based on bloodlines, but rather based on adherence to the laws of God. Mm-hmm. And peoples of different ancestries could join. So in the Bible, there's an entire book devoted to a figure named Ruth, who would in fact be King David's great-grandmother, just to give one example of the ways that a person could, just as a barbarian could become a member of the Populus Romanus, somebody could become a part of the Israelite nation as well by following the prerequisite laws.
Yeah.
And in the Golem episode, we discussed the matter of Abraham and Sarah making souls, quote unquote, which according to the non-mystical reading means making people aware of God and his laws, which goes to show that, again, not really a biological category in and of themselves. In the first centuries of the Common Era, plenty of Gentiles opted to become either fully or kind of Jewish. The latter people would become the so-called God-fearers. And one of the limiting factors here was that adult men really didn't want to get circumcised.
Yeah, they were scared of getting laughed at in the Roman bathhouse.
Yeah, so while Jewish ideas were popular, the idea of having to, undergo this procedure as an adult really didn't inspire much confidence in a lot of people.
Come on, man, that's where I pee.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so enter Paul, who argued that Jesus' sacrifice on the cross removed the need for circumcision and many parts of biblical law writ large. And so suddenly there was a biblically derived belief system which had many of the elements that Greco-Roman peoples in the Mediterranean would have found so appealing without having to undertake the more unpleasant aspects for men. So basically over the centuries, more people in the Roman Empire embraced Christianity rather than Judaism. And to a great extent, Christianity resulted in a significant synthesis, whereas the earlier Roman writers focused on the uniqueness of the Populus Romanus. Early Christian writers such as Augustine would look around and see a world full of populi, of which Christians were supposed to be one. Like basically literally citizens of the city of God. There's a great deal of contestation between worldly power and religious power, which would continue to be a factor all the way into the present day. But seeing as Christians these days don't usually see themselves as a nation first and foremost, the vision of the Christian people didn't really pan out.
Yeah. The idea of like a unified Christendom, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. But these ideas were part of a package that would soon spread outside the confines of the Roman world proper.
Right. As we discussed in our 33rd episode about the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome had a lot of compounding problems around the 200s, and although the Western Roman Empire would survive for a pretty impressive amount of time after that, about another 250 years, this period created a status quo that was a lot less centralized in many ways than the prior period of decentralization. And what this means for us is that there was a lot more emphasis on local identities and customs, less of a pan-Roman feeling. So for example, in the East during this period, the Greek language becomes more prestigious, and Greek-speaking Romans start looking toward more of the Greek past than the Roman past. A lot of local identities would eventually morph into the kinds of cultural identities that would eventually become medieval nation states during this period.
Yeah, but we should note that this was pretty much almost exclusively an upper class phenomenon. Lower class people had much bigger things to worry about at this point.
Right, yeah. And it's like today, like nationalism is a hobby, basically. You know, like nationalists love to believe that their ideas are eternal, that everybody shares their grievances, but basically every nationalist movement is driven by a bunch of weird, right-wing elitist nerds, dividing the peoples of the world in ways that they find entertaining and explaining why their division is the best.
Well, it depends on the type of nationalist and what exactly they're looking to do. And what separates modern nationalism from this stuff really is that it does have this massive appeal to it, right? It isn't just about like these bloodlines of these weird nobles who are all inbred 7 ways to hell. Like, this is about the people writ large. So there's some popular appeal there, but nevertheless, this is getting us ahead of ourselves. Another result of this crisis and the means used to resolve it was the increasing presence of so-called barbarians within the empire. And although this was a matter of degree rather than substance, this led to an exposure of new peoples to Romano-Christian thought. And many of these peoples would begin to conceptualize their ancestry along these lines. At a certain point, I found myself wondering why peoples would, what's the utility here? Why would peoples who presumably have their own origin stories opt to adopt foreign ones? And then I remembered that around a month ago, I read this really great book by Otoblowski, which is The Myth of the 12 Tribes of Israel. That might make an appearance in the later episode of Gladio Free Europe. Stay tuned. Wink, wink. But Otoblowski writes, members of sub-identities can, and frequently do, compete with each other not by denying the right of the other sub-identities to participate in an overarching one, but by redescribing the nature and significance of the relationships between them. Because ethnic claims do need to be legible to their intended audience, individual storytellers who want their claims to be perceived as authoritative cannot tell any story at all about the past, but those that will be intelligible in the context. In any given case, there are only a few traditions, a scarce amount, that are likely to provide the necessary authority. Where segmented frameworks are concerned, the mutual participation of different groups in what is ostensibly the same identity concept creates the condition of scarcity. Only claims advanced through the system will be mutually intelligible. For the same reason, however, a shared system offers considerable advantages to its participants, since all already agree on the authority of a particular set of traditions, which can be manipulated. Mutual participation means a mutual vocabulary for claim and counterclaim, especially when the parties involved agree that the others are members of a shared system. So, in other words, participating in the shared Romano-Christian tradition of genealogy will automatically make your claim legible and more prestigious to outsiders.
Right.
So, if you go around telling people that your lineage begins with the great King Grug, who slayed 20 dragons and assembled an army of 10,000 men and so subjugated 50 peoples, people are just going to be literally who?
Yeah.
Basically, and scoff at your weak lineage. But if you start with, for example, Brutus, and then add that Grug was the son of Brutus, it makes your claim feel more legit. So the Romano-Christian tradition became dominant because it was the dominant discursive landscape when these events were unfolding. And the Romans did a very similar thing, in fact. The Romans would later claim that Aeneas was the ancestor of Romulus and Remus, and Aeneas himself was previously a Greek mythological figure who had appeared.
He's from the Iliad.
Yeah, and the Homeric hymns, which predate the Iliad themselves. So as different barbarian peoples came into existence as peoples and consequently set up their own states, they knew that they wanted to model themselves on these kinds of claims. We've spoken about some of these peoples before, especially the Franks and the Saxons.
Yeah.
Gary argues that law was especially important for cementing the foundations of these peoples because it was through legal categories that previously barbarian peoples were able to prolong their existence. We don't really have time to get into how all this unfolded.
Yeah.
Check out the Gary book for all of this. Once again, it's called The Myth of Nations. Great book. But the long and short of it is that peoples like the Franks, the Goths, the Lombards, and so on, they started at the beginning as more of military castes who placed themselves at the head of the Roman aristocracy who would actually run the state. But over time, these categories of people sort of blended together and legal distinctions were no longer mandatory. So instead, in many cases, becoming a matter of preference for things like inheritance law, if at all.
Yeah, you know, one thing that the author Guy Halsall talked about is that this is also a period where just as peoples of, supposed barbarian origin are claiming that they're descended from figures like Aeneas, you also start seeing people with no barbarian ancestry claiming that they also have some kind of Gothic or Frankish heritage as a way to, match the whims of this, or match the tastes of this new ruling class.
Yes, exactly. So with time, geographic and class categories gained precedence, not really ethnic ones per se. Like over time, like the Franks just became like ethnically undistinguishable from the Roman caste that was actually running the state. They intermarried with them pretty extensively, and ultimately they would shed their languages. And after a few centuries of this, Roman itself began to lose its previous meaning.
Yeah.
It became a term that mostly signified people living in Rome rather than peoples who lived on the territory of what once was the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Despite this, Rome left a very long shadow, especially when it came to how people conceptualized their history and their relationship to other peoples. So in the nationalist discourses of the 19th century, these people would reappear in the discourse as harbingers of what Gary called primary acquisition, which is to say that people X were the first people to reside in or rule over a place, and therefore we, as their true heirs, have a right to it in perpetuity. And with that being said, before we get to the more modern stuff, let's look at this medieval myth-making and in practice, how it actually worked out.
Yes, and this is why, if I don't say so myself, Sam, this I think is the fun stuff, kind of digging into these specific claims, like the ones about how, the Egyptian princess Scota is the mother of the Scots and all that. What I think is kind of interesting is that, so we mentioned before that the Romans had their ideas about Romulus and Remus and Aeneas, and the barbarian peoples of Europe had similar ideas too. At least they did by the high medieval period once Christians descended from these groups started writing about them. So you have Danish Christian writers like Saxo Grammaticus, who writes this pretty famous book called Gesta Danorum, this huge text about the history of Scandinavia. And he claims...
Yeah, and it's also where Hamlet first appears.
Yes, that is. Yeah. We talked about him in our episode on the Northmen. That's right. And so Saxo claims that every single Danish person is descended from one guy. Can you guess his name, Sam?
Dan, I'm guessing?
Yes, that's right. There was one guy called Dan, and that Dan is the progenitor, the legendary progenitor of all of the Danes. You also have, of course, Saint Bede, who explains that Britain was invaded by these guys named Hengist and Horsa, these two brothers who were invited by a wicked Celtic king, and then once they got there, they brought over the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes. Modern historians don't give much credence to the idea that Angle, Saxon, and Jute were ever meaningful identities in early medieval Britain. There doesn't seem to be an archaeological or much of an additional textual record to suggest that. It seems like these groups had a very different idea about identity at all. But in any case, this was widely believed. And Hengist and Horsa themselves were part of a prestigious genealogy where they were the sons of Wictolus, who was the son of Witta, who was the son of Wecta, who was the son of Woden. And Woden, if anyone doesn't realize, is the same as the Norse god Odin. So even though Bede was a monk, he was very, very Christian, he was claiming that his own Anglo-Saxon ancestors were ultimately descended from Odin. Listen to episode 15 if you want to hear more about this.
The Franks, they would have an even stranger approach to this ancestry stuff. As you might remember from episode 36 on the origins of the Frank, there was a writer named Fredegar who believed that the Merovingian dynasty was descended from a magical sea cow called the Quintotar.
Right. And when we say sea cow, we mean like literally like a cow with a fishtail.
Yeah, so kind of like a Capricorn, but it's a cow. But yeah, so the Franks of Luxembourg believed that their ancestor Siegfried, who was probably a real guy, married a woman named Melusine, who probably wasn't real.
Right. And the reason she probably wasn't real is because, according to legend, she was a sorceress who magically conjured up a castle for Siegfried in the middle of Luxembourg on the day of their wedding. And so Melusine told Siegfried that she could use his powers to amass incredible wealth and power, but there's one condition. She always got to spend Saturdays to herself. He could never bother her. And so Siegfried agreed. And every week after they got married, Melusine would spend one day each week alone in her chambers. And nobody had any idea what was going on. Initially, Siegfried, went along with this. Saturdays are for the girls, right? She can do whatever she wants. But there were whispers around the Callus.
Yeah, she's just observing the Sabbath.
Yeah, there could be that. Who knows? Man, maybe she's secretly Jewish. And that's the thing. She could be doing something secret. Nobody knows. Some people in the palace said maybe she's bringing up lovers in there. Maybe she's worshiping Satan. Maybe she's just binge watching Simpsons episodes, Nobody knew what Melusine was doing. And that made Siegfried upset. He grew suspicious. He grew jealous. He was a pretty bad husband because one day he couldn't stand being in the dark any longer. So he snuck into Melusine's room and he saw that innocently she was just taking a bath. But then he realized a serpent's tail was hanging out of the bathtub. He cried out in surprise when he saw this. Is my wife taking a bath with a snake? And when she heard this, Melusine turned to him, and she got up, and up, and up, and up, because Siegfried realized to his horror that his wife's body turned into the lower form of a monstrous snake. That this whole time she was some kind of terrifying snake demon, and he never had any idea. She locked the door and bolted it. Siegfried was just pounding on the door trying to talk and learn what happened. Have you been a monster this whole time? And when he opened the door, she was gone. There was no sign of Melusine. There was just a huge crack in the floor going deep into the bowels of the earth, from whence Melusine had slithered and where she would then rest forevermore.
Was that true?
Yeah, I believe it. All of it.
Okay. Well, if you say so, you're really the early medieval European expert. But yeah, great stuff.
It's a great story. It's one of my favorites, right? Like it's great stuff. It's like so this is just like that's just like a classic piece of medieval folklore. There's songs like that. There's the Selkie stories from Ireland and Scotland, but this is a story that was widely believed. And it wasn't just that like the Luxembourgers insisted this and everybody else went along with it. Many other peoples of Europe had either had similar stories, like for instance, the people of Lusignan, or they said, oh, well, that's interesting. I believe you. You really are descended from Melusine. That's really cool. Your great-great-grandmother was a snake woman.
Yeah, and one of the more interesting instances of this that you dug up for this episode had to do with King Edward IV of England, who seemingly thought that his wife, Elizabeth Woodsville, was a descendant of Melusine, the snake woman. But 100 years before this, Geoffrey Chaucer recorded a very similar claim by another Edward, King Edward III. Quoting Chaucer now.
Edward told his friends that the founder of his line, Count Fulk the Black, ruler of Anjou, traveled to a distant land and returned with a bride whose beauty was unsurpassed in all the world. The children she bore were brilliant and handsome, like all the Plantagenet sons and daughters after them, but they carried also a darker heritage. She kept it secret for many years, living a life more secluded than a nun's. Then one day, the Count demanded that his wife accompany him to Mass, a thing she told him repeatedly she would never do. But then that day she did, pale and trembling. She entered the church, but when the priest raised the host, the Countess let out a terrible shriek, rose into the air, and flew out the chapel window, and was never seen or heard from again. The truth was finally out. Count Fulk's wife was Melusine herself, a daughter of the devil.
Yeah, this one reads as kind of different for me, at least, just because it seems like a very denigrating story for the children of this woman who was supposed to be Melusine, who once again came back to the earth and got exorcised from church, literally. I'm guessing that this would have been more like, just people poking fun at Edward III and his descendants, particularly.
Maybe so, yeah. I also like to think that he was like, this is why I'm so twisted.
Welcome to my twisted mind. So far, these folklore claims have been more about divine royal origins rather than the origins of an entire nation. But these kinds of local folklores, Greek mythology, and biblical scripture would slowly start to merge in the minds of medieval Europeans. And by the High Middle Ages, these sources would be synthesized into explanations for how entire kingdoms came to be.
Right, because after the fall of Rome, there were a lot of new kingdoms across Europe, states like the Franks, the English, all those guys, the Lombards. There were also older nations, like, for instance, Ireland, who had been around the time of the Romans, but they were just now starting to really write their own histories down, and often by now, they had been very strongly influenced with this kind of biblical Roman ideological toolset. And so one thing we have to note here, as we get into these kinds of national stories, is that earlier generations of historians in the 19th century, as well as many modern-day nationalists, assume that medieval people had the same ideas about ethnicity and the same understanding of their past that we have today. But this isn't true. I've used the word Celt a few times before, which, is often used today to link the Welsh people with the Irish and Scottish people, as well as the ancient Gaulish peoples of the European continent. But in the Middle Ages, there actually was no understanding of any common Celtic identity at all. Welsh people simply did not realize that they had a linguistic and cultural connection to the Irish that wouldn't be discovered until around 1700, when a Welsh scholar named Edward Llwyd proved that those two languages were connected.
Really? That's really interesting. Huh.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy? Yeah. And instead, medieval people had really different attitudes. Rather than anthropology, they had their own myths and legends, stuff like the Melusine story paired with the classical text that we've talked about. You mentioned how Herodotus was writing a universal history that tries to describe the entire world. A similar trend existed in the Middle Ages, where many different countries tried to produce their own universal chronicle, starting with the creation of the world, going into stuff like Noah's Ark and all that, and then going down to the recent history of the Danes or the Poles, or even like the people of Siena, Italy. Oftentimes they started very big and then ended very small, looking at the recent history of a real community. And so usually these histories, the opening chapters are very implausible, and the final chapters tend to be based on actual living memory. Because classical texts were the literary backdrop of basically all medieval Christendom, classical references tended to take precedence over figures like Woden or Melusine. So as an example of how Roman and Greek historical figures would be synthesized with traditional kind of folklore, Fredegar, who gave us that Quinator story, he wrote in the 7th century that the Franks, just like the Romans, were descended by losers of the Trojan War. The Trojans. This is basically just his version of the story of Aeneas, this Trojan prince who helps found Rome. But so centuries after the Aeneid was written, people started to think that other Trojan princes could maybe be their own ancestors, even if they lived hundreds of miles away from Troy. This gave the kind of important legitimacy that we talked about, right? Like you were saying about like Grug and Brutus. This is a great example of that. Nobody cared about who the Franks were, but Fredegar realized, possibly unconsciously, that if he could say that the Franks were Trojans, that suddenly meant that these people were a lot more important.
Yeah, exactly. I think that he was aware of it, and he was crafting this narrative in particular because this is what the Roman aristocracy and priests were doing for these new rulers, right? Like they basically came to them asking for a legitimizing mechanism to explain why they have a right to rule these places that previously had been under the authority of the emperor in Rome. It just made a lot of sense to try to put them in this same exact lineage as the emperors of great.
So Fredegar said that a long lost tribe of Trojans settled in Macedonia, where half of them became the famous Macedonians, and therefore the Franks and Alexander the Great were related, and then another half of them went north. Some of them went northwest and became the Franks of, the Netherlands, Salia, that we mentioned before, and the other half, or I guess the other quarter of the Franks, went east, where interestingly, Fredegar believed they became the Turks. So Turkish people at this time weren't living in the Mediterranean yet. They were living in Central Asia and along the Black Sea. But it's a really interesting cultural link. And I'm just kind of curious, Sam, this is a little bit off topic, but do you have any theories on why Fredegar might have wanted to think that the Turks and basically no other people in Europe except for the Macedonians were related to the Franks?
I mean, like if I had to hazard a guess, I'd say that maybe it had something to do with the power of these like steppe nomads who at this point probably would have been beginning to exert their influence over more central parts of Europe. Like basically, we know that the Slavs were able to gain a foothold in so much of Europe precisely because steppe peoples like the Scythians and presumably various Turkic-speaking groups would go into these places and pillage them, kill a bunch of people, take a bunch of people into slavery, and leave these really desolate lands that didn't really have many people on them. So Slavs would have later been able to like move in there and like settle the land and create their own settled societies off of the ruins of what had previously.
So I guess, yeah, so even though the Franks lived very far away from the Turks, they had some vague idea that, like, those guys are badass. Those guys are terrifying. Maybe we're just as badass and terrifying as them because we're their cousins.
Yeah, and I mean, the early Franks, they were very expansionist, and they got quite far with it. Like, they were basically, like, they conquered their way all the way down to, like, Catalonia, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and you know, this would have been after Fredegar, but in the east, the Franks would go to war with the Avars, who were Central Asian people who Fredegar might have been talking about when he says Turk.
I'm actually not sure what language the Avars would have spoken, but if it's...
We might have to do a whole Avar episode in the future, because that's a really fun mystery. There's a lot of theories, but I think we're kind of getting a little far afield. I guess what this shows is that who you want to describe as your relatives, in this worldview, is entirely political. It's not about modern day anthropological concerns, like, you know, stories about language. That's why we are going to return now to that story that opened the episode with Princess Scota, because what we told you before about how, you know, the Egyptians settled in Ireland and Scotland, that was like 20% of it. The full story is so much crazier. Before I get into it, Sam, are you familiar with the Book of Invasions before this? Had you ever read any of it or any summaries?
I skimmed the Wikipedia once, I think.
Okay. I'm just asking because it's really fun stuff. It's this entire world of Irish mythology, which has some interesting links to the Christian and pre-Christian mythologies of other countries in the region, but it's really weird.
And I don't really know much about it, but I believe I read at some point that it might preserve elements even of pre-Indo-European mythology.
It's possible, yeah. I would not go so far as to making a claim like that, but it's absolutely possible because it's about this idea of kind of layers of culture, the kinds of things that archaeologists today often deal with, like how, you know, peoples are very migratory, how one culture will sometimes give way to another. And that's kind of the whole point of this. A lot of people think it's actually an especially big influence on modern fantasy writing. Like, I think that this is probably as close as you can get to Tolkien, even more so than like the Prose Edda. I think it's this. Because when you look at the Book Invasions, which in Irish Gaelic is the Lebor Gabala Eran, it explains how Ireland was formed by this bizarre mixing of many different cultures, both human and non-human. And just like the works of other medieval historians, it is a universal history. And it's in some way, I believe it's actually one of the earliest universal histories to exist, probably written around the 10th century. And so according to the Book of Invasions, Ireland began as not the Emerald Isle that we know, but as a brown, rocky place populated initially by non-human spirits. The first ones to be there were the Fomorians, who crawled out of the earth like Melusine. And these guys were basically demons. They're described as monstrous. Some of them have one, I believe they have one arm, one leg, and one eye, and others are humanoid, which allows them to, you know, trick and seduce humans. The other group of spirits at this time were the Tuatha Dé Danann. These guys are more well known because they're pretty close to Tolkien's idea of elves. These are these kind of fair, noble, magical people who are in some ways better than humans, and they kind of know that. And so for that reason, they look down on mortal people.
So orcs and elves.
That's a great comparison, right? Yeah. A lot of people say it's you know, or like you could say in the Elder Scrolls version, it would be the dark elves and the high elves. But yeah, that's a great comparison. And so those two guys are there first, the Fomorians and the Tuatha. And then different humans slowly start to settle Ireland even before the children of Scota get there. You first have a group called the Partholonians, led by a guy named Bartholomew, who introduced farming to Ireland. But it's so hard and rocky that they really can't farm very well. And even worse, the Fomorians don't want to share their land with any humans. They have a huge war against the Partholonians, and it looks like the Partholonians are going to win. They kill a ton of Fomorians, but they don't realize the Fomorians have cursed them with a terrible plague that causes every Partholonian to die except for one, a guy named Tuan, who's cursed to live forever in the body of various animals, witnessing the rest of Irish history, but being unable to tell anybody or warn anybody about it.
Wow, that's Really great story. Kind of reminds me of the prose Edda a bit. Very similar elements going into this, I feel like. The pre-Christian Nordic mythology and stories synthesized by someone who had already been someone from a family that had already been Christian for several generations at this point.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's after that part about the Partholonians where the kind of obligatory classical references come in. Because then the book explains other groups of humans came, such as the Nemedians, who were from Scythia. You know, Scythia is always coming up in these stories. The whole Noah's Ark link, the whole, and so this time, these Scythian Nemedians get to Ireland and they deal with the Fomorians again. The Fomorians don't want to kill them all this time, but instead they make them their peasants and they force the Nemedians to give them 2/3 of their wheat, their milk, and their children as slaves every year at Samhain, which is, the Gaelic holiday that eventually became Halloween. Eventually the Nemedians can't take this anymore, and so they rise up against their Fomorian oppressors, but they're terribly crushed and they leave Ireland. Some of them settle in Britain, becoming the Welsh, but another group called the Fir Bolg, which means people of the bag, goes to Greece, where the Greeks, just like the Fomorians, brutally enslave them, making them carry heavy bags of dirt and sand across Greece, doing their dirtiest, grimiest labor.
It's interesting how at the top of the episode you said that no one really knew that the Irish and the Welsh didn't know that they had common origins until the 17th century, but here it's pretty clearly positing that, there are these people, they wouldn't have called them Celts, but nevertheless they came to Ireland, then they got kicked out of Ireland, then they settled in Wales.
That's true. You're right. So there was an idea that the Welsh and the Irish had a connection, but it was seen as a connection, as we're about to see, that was basically identical as the connection to the Egyptians. Because after the Fir Bolg, the guys who were enslaved in Greece, after they go back to Ireland and they make the island green for the first time, thanks to their exposure to superior Greek science, another group eventually comes in. This is, of course, the children of Scota, who've spent 440 years traveling the world and now live in Spain. They invade Ireland, which has now been taken back by the Tuatha, like the elves, and they fight another terrible war against these spirits. But the Gaels, rather than trying to eradicate the Tuatha, make an agreement where the Gaels will rule the overworld and the Tuatha will rule the underworld. Centuries later, one group of Gaels will become Christian and migrate into northern Britain, where one group of the children of Scota create a kingdom named after their ancestor, Scotland.
Wow, that's really nuts.
And so that's a fun story. It's a great legend, but I think the reason we're saying this here, not just because it's fun, is because people really believe that. As late as the 17th century, there were clerical sources, like Irish priests recounting official Irish histories that mentioned, oh yeah, the Fomorians, the Tuatha, like these were guys who were completely Christian, but thought that their 17th century worldview was not incompatible with a belief in these magical spirits of the earth.
And the Irish and the Scots, they weren't the only people to do this, of course. Now let's turn our eyes slightly to the east, to the shores of England and Wales. Around the same time, the English and the Welsh had their own epic history genre. There was a 12th century so-called historian called Geoffrey of Monmouth who wrote his Historia Regum Britanniae. This guy, Geoffrey of Monmouth, he was a Norman priest, and today this book is castigated as a historical source because it's just too far out there, even by the standards of medieval chronicles. But nevertheless, everyone who's listened to this podcast for a while is familiar with this text because it's our biggest early source for the mythos of King Arthur and King Lear. But Geoffrey's early history of Britain is even crazier than anything about Merlin or Morgan Le Fay.
Right, and just like the Book of Invasions, it was totally batshit crazy, but also very widely read. And by the end of the Middle Ages, Geoffrey's account had been translated into Middle English, and its opening chapters were widely republished as something called the Brute Chronicle, after its central character, a guy called Brutus, we're about to jump into. This book was so popular that more than 200 copies of the Brute Chronicle survive, which is, I think, pretty rare. And eventually, when a guy named William Caxton brought the first printing press to England in the reign of Edward IV, that's the one who married the girl who said she was descended from Melusine, by that point, the story of Brutus ended up being like the second book he ever printed. That's how popular and how widespread these theories were. So here is a quick summary of Geoffrey of Monmouth's mythic prehistory of Britain. He draws from a couple different Welsh sources. He probably spoke a little bit of Welsh, even though he was a Norman, but a lot of it people think he just made up. And okay, so this is the story, and remember, for hundreds of years, Many people believe this.
And so, as Geoffrey of Monmouth tells it, thousands of years ago, there was a king of either Greece or Syria who was named Diocletian, who was a descendant of Noah's son Japheth, who had 33 daughters who were all set to marry different foreign kings. And of course, this being the style at the time, they didn't have any choice in the matter. The 33 daughters were really upset about this, and they resented their father Diocletian for forcing them into marriage. And so the night before this mass wedding was to take place between these daughters and the foreign kings, the oldest daughter, Albina, told her sisters that they can't go through with the wedding. "My fair sisters," she said, "we know full well that the king, our father, has always despised us and now schemes to make us obedient unto our husbands. But how can I obey my husband if I come from more noble blood than he does?" And so the sisters realized, yeah, that's not fair. We're so high-blooded that our husbands should be obedient to us, not the other way around. So Albina told them her plan. "On our wedding night, when our husbands are abed, we shall cut their throats and be free of them. But it has to happen under our father's roof, because we have power here." So when Diocletian awoke the next morning, he saw the bloodbath. He was so horrified that he ordered all 33 of his daughters to be sent on a ship far, far away from his kingdom. They were commanded to sail for half a year until they found land. Eventually, the sisters landed on an uninhabited island, which Albina decided to name Albion after herself. The sisters lived there on Albion for a year, but eventually they got lonely. They were out in the middle of nowhere after all. So they thought about getting new husbands, but human men were too scared of them after what they had done. Instead, they decided to invite the devil to Albion, and all became his brides. And in this way, the 33 daughters gave birth to 33 giants. The oldest of them was named Gog Magog and was born to Albina herself. Gog Magog and his brothers and or cousins chose a piece of land on the island of Albion to rule over for centuries.
Meanwhile, back in the Mediterranean, while all those 33 giants are being born, which I feel like is very like Shadow of the Colossus right there. It's very, it's like a video game kind of thing. While all that was happening, the Trojans were, as always, losing the Trojan War. And so Prince Aeneas, another descendant of Japheth, settled in Italy. Like we all know, he yada yada yada, meets the king of the Latins, becomes the ancestor of Romulus and Remus. But according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, he also had another kid nobody knew about named Brutus. And as you might expect from his name, Brutus was a bit of a brute. Not very good except for fighting, which meant that when he was just 15 years old, he accidentally killed his father in a hunting accident and was therefore exiled from Italy. He fled to Greece, where, just like in the Irish stories, turns out the Greeks are basically assholes because they are oppressing fellow descendants of the Trojans for picking the wrong side in the Trojan War. Brutus meets up with a group of 600 men who are all his distant cousins, and it turns out that a Greek king named Pandrasus is oppressing them due to their heritage. Brutus rallies up all of these Trojan guys to fight the Greeks and to overthrow Pandrasus. And so even though they only have 600 men, they lead this kind of guerrilla campaign against him. Eventually they have a great victory against Pandrasus. They capture the wicked Greek king and they sign a peace deal where the young Brutus, who's by now only like 20 years old, marries the king's daughter Ignogi as part of the peace deal. He was about to turn Pandrasus' kingdom into his own and make it a new Troy, a place for these 600 exiled Trojans to finally live in peace. But as soon as he was about to proclaim this new kingdom, one of the Trojans spoke out and told him this might be a bad idea because you see, there were only 600 Trojans left in the world. There were thousands, maybe even millions of Greeks, and they would be totally surrounded by hostile Greek kingdoms. So Brutus realized if they wanted a new Troy, it would have to be founded far away from the Greeks, at a place where they couldn't be outnumbered. So because of that, Brutus chose to leave Greece altogether and sail west until he could find a land without people for his people without land. Their first stop was the Adriatic island of Lefkada, which was totally deserted. Maybe that's good, but then they realized it's, too small, you can't really have a kingdom there, and it's also too close to Greece, they could bother you anytime. But before they left Lefkada, they found one interesting spot, an overgrown, ruined temple to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. Brutus thought, maybe great Artemis can give us some kind of advice about where to sail next. So he ordered his men to kill a deer and light sacred fires. They sacrificed the deer meat and they laid out the skin of the deer in front of the old statue to Artemis. And there, Brutus looked up at the stone face and he offered her a prayer.
"Goddess of woods, tremendous in the chase, to mountain board and all the savage race, wide over the ethereal walks extends thy sway, and over the infernal mansions void of day, look upon us on earth unfold our fate, and say what region is our destined seat. Where shall we next thy lasting temples raise, and choirs of virgins celebrate thy praise?
They probably would have rhymed fate with seat, so it was probably like sate, which is kind of funny.
Yeah, I noticed that. It felt too awkward to try that.
That's Middle English for you. So so Brutus, he makes his prayer, he goes to sleep on the deer skin laid out in front of the statue, and then that night, he's awoken. And magically, the statue of Artemis has turned into the living form of the goddess herself. And she tells Brutus,
Brutus, there lies beyond the Gaelic bounds an island which the western sea surrounds. By giants once possessed, now few remain, to bar thy entrance or obstruct thy reign. To reach that happy shore thy sails employ, their fate decrees to raise a second Troy, and found an empire in thy royal line, which time shall ne'er destroy, nor bounds confine.
So then Brutus said, all right, great, beyond Gaelic binds, let's go. And so he led his men to the far west of the known world. First, to get supplies, they landed in Gaul, specifically the southwestern region known as Aquitaine. This was also called Galla Aquitania, and I'm gonna bet you money that the only reason they mentioned Galla Aquitania is because Julius Caesar, centuries before this was written, mentioned that Gallia Aquitania is the only place in Gaul where Celts do not live. Because, and I believe that because, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, when they got to Aquitaine, it was still full of Celts, but it was at war with another exiled tribe of, you guessed it, Trojans, led by a guy called Corineus, who was one of the strongest men in the known world. Brutus meets up with Corineus, and they find out that, hey, wait a minute, we're cousins, we're also Trojans, and they really quickly get along well. Because Corineus's Trojans have lived in Gaul for so long, they'd become Celtic speakers, but Brutus recognized that they had this kind of like level of sophistication and a fighting spirit that set them apart from the rest. So he said, you know what, you and I, we got to team together. And just as we defeated our Greek oppressors back in Greece, we're going to defeat these Celtic oppressors here in Gaul. So they defeat the Gallic king and then carry out a terrible massacre of every Gaulish man, woman, and child in Aquitaine.
Well, he certainly lived up to his name.
Yeah, Brutus the Brute, right? Yeah. And I think this is probably a reference to the fact that Julius Caesar said that Aquitaine is the only place where Celts don't live today because Brutus killed them all. And so after this battle/genocide, Brutus offered Corineus to share the island of Albion that had been promised by Artemis. So these two kings, with their now much larger joined army, sail across the channel where they have a great battle against each of the 33 giants. They go all across Albion, looking into the caves, looking into, underneath the bridges or whatever, looking for these giants. Eventually, 32 of them have been slain. Only one remains. It's the first to be born, the last to die, Gog Magog, greatest of the giants, son of Albina. Because Corineus was the strongest guy around, he told Gog Magog that they should have a wrestling match, and Gog Magog agreed. So all of the men gathered to watch this fight happening at the edge of the cliffs of Dover, where Corineus grappled with Gog Magog. Initially, Corineus seemed to have the upper hand, but Gog Magog was so strong that he was able to, wrench Corineus onto the floor. And then it seemed like Corineus was about to die. Gog Magog was squeezing him so hard that Corineus' ribs started to crack. And then Corineus' eyes rolled back. It was over. He was dead. So Gog Magog let go of him and looked up to gloat. Look, you humans, you thought you could defeat me, but no, not even your strongest man can kill me. And that's when Corineus got up. He was faking. He wasn't dead at all. He grabs a hold of Gog Magog, rushes to the edge of the cliff, and knocks him over the edge, where Gog Magog's body terribly breaks on the rocks. And supposedly, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, a rock formation is known as like the bones of Gog Magog or something even today. And so after the death of the final giant, Brutus declared that the island of Albion would be split into two kingdoms. One kingdom in the southwest would be called Cornwall, after Corineus, and the rest of the island would be called Britain, after him, Brutus. And so eventually they would adopt the Celtic language, and the descendants of Corineus and Brutus would rule Albion for hundreds of years until Julius Caesar would eventually come to make it part of Rome.
Wow, it sounds like Corineus got a really rough deal. I mean, he's the reason why they can settle there in the first place, and all he gets is this tiny little peninsula.
That's true, but I have heard English people say that Cornwall is maybe the prettiest part of England, so it's definitely the nicest part in terms of weather.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, maybe it wasn't that bad. He just got to be the governor of British Florida in that case.
Yeah. So this story, obviously incredibly wacky, all the giants, the devil stuff, the 33 daughters. But just like the Irish folk invasions, it was really widely believed up until the early modern era. I say up until the early modern era because, roughly corresponding with the Protestant Reformation, you see this general trend in skepticism toward these earlier medieval genealogical ancestral claims. For the first time, scholars start to cast doubt on the existence of these legendary progenitors at all. People in Denmark start to think that, maybe instead of us being named after Dan, maybe Dan is named after us.
Yeah, so as we mentioned, the Romans saw Aeneas and Romulus and the tribe of the Latins as their progenitors, but Niccolo Machiavelli wrote that there is no way that this could have been true because he suggested that over the centuries, people said that the city had been founded by the warrior Aeneas, the foundling Romulus, and the indigenous Latins when they wanted to emphasize different aspects of their civilization's past and imagined character. So by the late 16th and early 17th century, there was a similar wave of skepticism starting to set in across the British Isles writ large. The English and the Scottish Protestants were increasingly uncomfortable with any use of these ancient histories that were not strictly rooted in biblical scripture. And by the start of the 17th century, the works of Geoffrey of Monmouth were largely regarded as superstition. But nevertheless, these kinds of genealogies, they continued to be around. Pretty famously, James VI of Scotland, or James I of England, as he later became, he had a pretty great genealogy drawn up for him, which was basically suffused with all of these lessons. So the idea that the entirety of the British Isles needs to be under one king. And that was the mistake of one of the previous kings who decided that he would split the island up between his sons because he didn't want to choose. And so James, as this Scottish man who was coming to the English throne, was in this way trying to legitimize his own right to rule in this regard, because at the end of the day, he's still the descendant of Brutus and all of these guys. But also James, he was a very smart guy, not a very pleasant guy to be around in many cases, but very smart, very skeptical. In fact, while doing research for this episode, I came across an anecdote where he was traveling around County Durham and he was visiting the Lumley Castle, which belonged to the Lumley family. And so he was shown several of these pedigrees which traced the ancestry of the Lumleys via these mythical ancestors all the way back to Adam and Eve and from there to God. And so upon seeing this, it said that the king commented, "By my soul, I did not ken that Adam's name was Lumley." So ken being an archaic word for no. So clearly, even if he didn't believe this stuff personally and had a sense of humor about it, he saw that it would be useful for his own purposes when...
Yeah, the King James genealogy is actually a really important point here because it was in the reign of King James that certain aspects of the Brutus myth started to be kind of stepped away from scholars, and something else that King James incorporated into his own genealogy, which had not really been part of British nationalism before, was the idea that Brits and Scots were both descended from lost tribes of Israelites, starting this sort of ideological strain that would really come to a head in the late 19th century, which suggested that the real descendants of the Jews were not modern-day Jews, but instead British Protestant Christians.
Stay tuned. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Yes. This was generally an anti-Semitic theory, either explicitly or implicitly, but this did have a pretty wide purchase in society. A lot of people started to think that, maybe we are descended from Jews. And in addition to that, this also kind of meant that, at least in Scotland, the previous theory about descent from Scota and a connection to the Egyptians starts to disappear around the time of this King James. So early on in this King James rule, the Parliament of Scotland totally reversed course on their policy toward the Romani. The king's grandfather, James the Fifth, had previously given extreme toleration to the Romani, which was pretty unusual. But now, around, I think it's 1609 or something, the Parliament passes a pretty infamous law that's simply called Act Against the Egyptians, which completely reverses the toleration by the previous King James and makes it illegal to even be Romani in Scotland. Hundreds of Romani people were deported en masse to Scandinavia, particularly Norway and Finland, and any who refused to leave could be murdered by Scottish citizens on sight without recourse. I don't know why exactly this law happened. There were probably a lot of reasons on the ground, but I do think that it kind of seems to hint at the fact that changing attitudes about your own identity lead to changing attitudes about, or lead to, it can lead to some kind of changing foreign relations. If you no longer see a group of people as your cousins, you're not going to try to protect them anymore. Instead, you might treat them incredibly brutally if it's prudent to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that's going to come back to haunt us as a species many, many times. But before we get to the really downer stuff, let's talk about something a little more uplifting. Let's talk about the Swedes and their descent from the Goths.
This is a funny one because this is one where it's not entirely wrong. There are genuine connections between the land of Sweden and the Gothic people, but this is one of those things like, I don't know, like the correct theories by Aristotle, where he might have accidentally gotten something right, but he totally went about the wrong way of being right about it. Because what happened in the early modern period of Sweden is that the nation of Sweden was newly independent. In something like 1523, it shrugged off the Danish yoke and became a fully independent kingdom for the first time in a few centuries. There was a very big interest in the Swedish government explaining to the world that it was this new important European power. Problem was, people didn't really know or care much about Sweden outside of Scandinavia. So the Swedes realized they needed their own legendary backstory, but it seemed too far-fetched to try to connect themselves to the Romans or to the Greeks, just as the Brits had done, or the Trojans. And I think partially it's because by now there had been some skepticism toward those kinds of classical claims. They realized, though, that there were other classical groups they could portray as their ancestors. Not the Greeks and the Romans, but instead some of the barbarian enemies who the Greeks and the Romans faced. And so the obvious group for the Swedes to link to was the Goths, because the Goths were easily the most prestigious of all the barbarian peoples. They were the ones who sacked and then basically supplanted the Western Roman Empire. They set up a great kingdom in Spain, in the south of France. They were people that everybody had heard of, if only in disparaging terms. Part of the reason also is because there are a lot of place names in Sweden that may or may not be connected to the origin of the word Goth. There's Jotaland, there's Gotland, there's Gothenburg. They all kind of sound like the word Goth. And also Jordanes, who was a writer who himself was of distant Gothic descent, who lived in the Byzantine Empire, he believed that the Goths initially came from Scandinavia, particularly from Sweden. And again here, this in the broadest sense might be true. Archaeologists do think that all Germanic-speaking cultures, at least their languages and their identities, start in southern Scandinavia, like Sweden and Denmark. So it probably is true that some ancestors of the Goths lived in Sweden, but this does not mean that the modern Swedish nation can be understood as an extension of Gothic society, because if Gothic was ever spoken in Sweden, it was quickly replaced by what would later become the Swedish language. These are kind of, it's like a sibling relationship, not a father-son relationship, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, like, if I'm not mistaken, the Gothic language, it's actually quite well preserved, considering how most Germanic languages of this era where basically all we have from them is just like a few runic inscriptions, like this guy owns this thing and things like that. But with the Goths, they became Christian quite early on, and the Bible was even translated into their language. So consequently, we have a pretty large corpus of Gothic language works.
Yeah.
But anyway, Gothic is an East Germanic language, I believe,
right.
Whereas Norse and German, and those are West Germanic languages. So
right, yeah. So like the languages are quite separate. Like there's no direct genealogical link between, the nation of the kingdom of the Goths and the kingdom of Sweden, or the language of the Goths and the language of Sweden.
Well, if you go back far enough, but yeah, nothing substantial.
Again, it's like a sibling relationship, not a father-son kind of thing, right? They didn't say we share a common origin with the Goths. They said the Goths are our ancestors. That's not correct.
Yeah.
The reason they said this was it was totally political. It was because, this could give them this link to Rome, and it also gave them an antagonistic link to Rome, which suddenly became really important by the later 16th century when Sweden was Protestant, because this meant that the idea of these, northern party fighters overthrowing Rome, that almost seemed like a threat to the modern Catholic order. which, the Swedes were very proud of. They loved flexing their muscles like that. 200 years ago, people in Rome hardly knew what a Swede was. Now, by the 17th century, they were hearing terrifying stories about Swedish armies in the 30 Years' War.
Yeah, and in fact, there's another parallel here because the Goths, even though they became Christian, they became Arians and not really what became Orthodoxy.
They weren't. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, they weren't. Yeah, they didn't become like proto-Catholics like they were supposed to. That's a really great point. Yeah, the Christians of Rome saw them as heretics. Yeah. One last little kind of funny thing here is that from what I understand, the Gothicism thing kind of pretty quickly petered out. I think sadly because explicitly racial ideologies became more popular in Sweden. But before that happened, a little kind of funny side note is that this whole thing started with Sweden expressing to the world their independence after becoming independent from Denmark. But the Danes they didn't want the Swedes to have all the fun, and they were kind of jealous of that. So the Danes actually said, you know what the Swedes are saying about the Goths? They're wrong. The real Goths are us Danes, because you know how they're saying that like that part of Sweden, Jotaland, sounds like the word Goth? Well, there's a part of Denmark called Jutland, and the Jutes, they're actually Goths. So that was how, the Danes tried to jump on that too. And I just find that very funny.
Well, you know what? I think they're both correct, but this story is missing out the fact that both of these people are descended from the Canaanites and the Phoenicians.
Of course, yeah. No, we talked a little bit, if anyone remembers, we talked a little bit about the potential, Canaanite link with the ancient Germanic peoples way back when. I don't remember what episode that was. That was like the...
Yeah, that was like episode 3 of that Barbarians.
Yeah, that was...
Very long time ago. Almost 2 years now.
Although, we should mention, Barbarians content might be coming back to this pod pretty soon.
Yeah, stay tuned. There's a new season out, and maybe we'll feel inspired to put out some more content.
All right, so we're kind of getting to the end of the episode. We're about to get to the really not fun part of this episode. But before we get there, we have 2 other claims. That being the idea that Poles are descended from the ancient nomadic Sarmatians, and that Ashkenazi Jews are descended from the ancient nomadic Khazars. Mm-hmm. You've probably heard of the second theory, potentially in a not very pleasant context, because it survives today through crank theories, many of which are explicitly anti-Semitic. But the origin is quite the opposite. And really the origin of both of these comes with the fact that, just like Sweden, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was really interested in painting a classical history for itself in the early modern period. Previously, they said that the Poles, who were also called Lechites, were all descended from one guy called Lech. But then some Polish intellectuals thought that this story wasn't grand enough. They realized it would be useful to connect their early history to the classical past. The way they did this was they looked at old maps of Eastern Europe, the earliest surviving maps that they had, or copies of maps, and they saw that where the regions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth would be, like 1,000 years before this, was always listed as Scythia or Sarmatia, named after, these Ironic-speaking nomadic peoples that lived in ancient Eastern Europe. So they thought that, wait a minute, if we live in Sarmatia, we must therefore be descendants of the Sarmatians. One issue here was that there was a lot of widespread Polish folklore explaining the whole Lech connection, this Slavic history, the idea that there was an ancient Slavic tribe, all of the Slavs are brothers. The Poles weren't into that theory. They weren't so happy about being lumped together with other Slavic-speaking peoples, east and south of them. You actually kind of still see hints of this today, I would say, in modern nationalism.
Yeah, although I'd say that this was a bit different than modern day Polish antagonism towards Russians and whatnot. I think that the Sarmatianism claims had more to do with the fact that just like the Western European aristocracy was trying to differentiate itself from the people whom they ruled. So whereas the kings of France are descended from the Franks, the common people are the Gauls. So basically this lower race, so to speak. The Polish aristocracy wanted to do a very similar thing where they claimed that these Slavs, they're the peasant feudal race, but we're the Sarmatians, we're the freedom-loving people. We have the right to rule over them because we're natural leaders.
Right. So it's more about internal divisions than external divisions. That's really interesting.
Yeah, at least that's what my opinion is as a relatively uninformed outsider.
And I think you're right about this, because that really what I read about this was that actually was how it was mostly employed. It was meant to say that when they were talking, when Polish nobility were talking derisively about Slavs, they mostly meant Slavic-speaking peasants in their own countries, not Russians next door. I think you're right. And interestingly, they also said that a Sarmatian didn't have to be Polish, because most ethnic minorities, I say most because one group was conspicuously excluded, most most ethnic minorities could also claim to be long-lost Sarmatian tribes who eventually, just like the Trojans who started speaking Celtic, adopted the language of the barbarian Slavs. So they said that if you were Lithuanian, you could be Sarmatian. If you were noble but you were Ukrainian, you could be Sarmatian. And speaking of Ukrainians, one group was particularly interesting to the Poles at this time, and that was the Cossacks. Because in this proto-nationalist worldview, if the Polish-Lithuanian people are descended from these kind of, nomadic steppe barbarians, there's nobody in their empire who's more of a nomadic steppe barbarian than the Cossacks. Therefore, the Cossacks are like the best symbol of Sarmatianism.
Yeah, that's, it's quite interesting because the Cossacks of this time, we're vaguely familiar with them as basically the Tsar's military caste who just did pogroms against Jews. But yeah, and it's very interesting, right? Because that's not how they started at all. Because, in the beginning, these Cossacks, they were basically serfs who had escaped away from living under a cruel serf order where you had a lord who would demand a very significant part of everything you produced. And he had all these ways to take advantage of you. You were being bled dry. So rather than put up with that, these Slavic speaking peasants would run off into the steppe where they would encounter all kinds of people who lived on horseback rather than by farming the land, as many of these peoples had done before. So the Cossacks, they were nomadic. And the word Cossack itself, it actually comes from a Turkic word. It's the same root as the Kazakh, people of Kazakhstan. Yeah, meaning free people. Vaguely. So basically these Cossacks, they basically acculturated to a more Turkic way of living on the steppe. And so these guys, they were really scratching an itch that the Polish aristocracy wanted to scratch because on the one hand, they're Slavic speaking, but on the other hand, their lifestyle is so unlike the average Slavic peasant that this is something that's to be looked up to. Well, at least when they weren't warring against them because these Cossacks were themselves raiding as steppe people are wont to do. But anyway, Polish officials began promoting this Cossack style of clothing as an official way to dress. It was very trendy, and they were even adopting foreign fashions from as far away as Central Asia and Iran.
Yeah, because remember, because there are no longer any Sarmatians in the world. It's an extinct culture, so they had to kind of make up stuff as they went along. That's why they were bringing in Persian rugs. They were even bringing in Chinese furniture. Anything Eastern was seen as part of this ancient Sarmatian culture, and this actually permeated into all levels of the population. A great example of this is that modern day Hasidic Jewish clothing is believed to be inspired by 18th century supposedly Sarmatian Polish clothing, which I think is pretty cool. But a lot of these kinds of Sarmatian fashions were totally invented. I think the best example of this, the most famous example, is that everyone's heard of the winged hussars, right? The famous heavy cavalry of Poland who wore heavy feathered wings. A lot of people think those wings.
Yeah, the guys who saved Vienna.
That saved Vienna famously. A lot of people think those wings were an early example of Sarmatianism. People imagine that their, barbarian ancestors would have worn something like that. So they added them to these early modern military uniforms.
But yeah, as this Sarmatian current had very interesting proto-racialist undertones going on, as I mentioned, we Sarmatians, where the steppe people were free, were natural rulers, whereas the Slavs, their lot in life is to be slaves, basically. Well, not quite slaves, but, close enough. And so this really gets to an interesting aspect of the theory of racism as it developed. And many people just assumed that racism was always about looking at foreign people who may look different from you and using that difference in phenotype to justify hatred. But in fact, the earliest early modern examples of racism were really built upon this idea of the nobility being of a different biological background, literally, than their peasantry.
Well, if you think about the idea of noble blood, it's really creepily similar to white supremacy.
Yeah, so that's why I said earlier that nationalism is about taking these things and giving them a mass character where it was previously nobles who cared about this stuff. And so later nationalism, it was basically this idea of extending nobility to everyone who resides on the territory of the nation and meets certain criteria, right? So it was no longer just a couple of thousand of anemic guys who go to balls all day and squander the wealth of the nation while the peasants peasantry have to pay outrageously high taxes. Now it was, we're all Germans,
Right.
we're all French, we're all British, and as such, we all have a duty to fight for our nation.
Yeah.
The first people to really use this to great effect were, of course, the French.
Yeah, after the revolution, yeah.
Yeah, after the revolution, but later it took on much more sinister overtones.
Right. And what's interesting is that as it took on these kind of, as racialism developed, it never really strayed away entirely from this kind of medieval genealogical origin. Like I mentioned, the British stopped talking about Brutus and all that. They started talking more abstractly about the Celts and the Anglo-Saxons as their ancestors. But many elements of this remained. And an important early division here is the fact that we've mentioned the name Japheth throughout this episode. That's one of the sons of Noah, typically seen as an ancestor of various European nations. Another one of Noah's sons was Shem, who was seen as the ancestor of various Middle Eastern peoples. One of these being, of course, the Jewish people. This meant that, according to this worldview, there was an inherent connection shared by a Brit and an Italian as sons of Japheth that they didn't share with any Jewish person who happened to be living in that same country. Even if this Jewish person was, culturally incredibly English or Italian, because they were a son of Shem and not a son of Japheth, they were seen as basically as a separate group. This meant that within the context of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Jewish people were never really invited into the great Sarmatian tent the way that everybody else was. Even though some wealthy Jewish people began copying the Sarmatian fashions of the aristocracy, they were always seen as a separate group entirely.
Yeah. And so the separation, it really prompted Jewish thinkers at the time, because again, Jews weren't insulated from any of these trends, to start to think about the origins of the Jewish people beyond just Shem. And so basically these Jewish scholars, they found their own legendary progenitors among a very interesting people who had dominated the region of the Black Sea some centuries before. Jewish scholars in the Commonwealth of Poland, Lithuania, which would eventually get absorbed into the much more anti-Semitic Russian Empire, read about the medieval Khazar Khaganate,
Yes.
which was a barbarian Turkic society with really interesting connections to Judaism.
Very cool people.
Yeah, we mentioned them in our Origins of Rus episode.
Yeah. They're really fun people done terribly by pop history. It's a disgrace.
These Ashkenazi scholars, they of course believe that their ultimate origin was in the land of Israel because, obviously that's where Judaism originates, that's where the temple was. But they needed to find a way to connect that to where they were now living in Eastern Europe into what was now Russia and Poland. So maybe, they thought, the first Jews to leave Israel for Europe had landed and had become the legendary Khazars who had dominated the region centuries prior. And then slowly over time, these Khazars, they would lose their Turkic language and come to speak Yiddish, which would explain their origins and would also explain that these are not outsiders, but rather people who had been in the region for hundreds of years and had been central players throughout history.
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting kind of parallel with the whole Gothic thing with Sweden, because, Swedes, they were never marginalized, obviously, but Swedes kind of were outsiders in a different way. They were geographic outsiders to most European politics. So it's in the same way, it's saying that actually, even if you think we're not part of this broader system, we are, and we always have been, so you should respect us.
Yeah, exactly. Both Jewish and Gentile scholars from the middle of the 19th century were very interested in this new strain of racial science and either proving or disproving that European Jews were members of this imagined Japhetic race, later known as the Aryans. So by the start of the 20th century, you had Jewish scholars like Isidore Loeb and Maurice Fishberg who thought that they could fight anti-Semitism by proving that Ashkenazi Jews were actually not descended from Middle Eastern Jews at all, but instead were European Khazar converts who had always lived in the region. And in this way, they could never be considered alien and therefore should be welcomed by anti-Semites as European compatriots. And this was incredibly naive, of course. Anti-Semitism would increase over the first half of the 20th century to the greatest heights it had ever seen, with the bloodiest results that had ever happened. And so the Khazar theory, which had initially been formulated by Jews to explain their origins in Eastern Europe as a way to fight against anti-Semitism, ended up being revived as a part of the anti-Semitic toolkit to say that Ashkenazi Jewish people weren't really Jews.
Right, and that's why if you Google the word Khazar today, or even worse, look in the Twitter search bar, you're going to find a little bit of actual discussion about one of my favorite historical cultures, and you're going to find a lot more bizarre anti-Semitic propaganda by neo-Nazis and Black Hebrew Israelites.
Yeah, it's really great stuff. We really ought to do a Khazar episode one day. There's just
we might have to, only because I don't think any human culture has been done as dirty as the Khazars. Like maybe the Vandals, with what their name means now.
Yeah, but speaking of Nazis, there's actually a very darkly funny note in this story. Mm-hmm. When the Nazis first rolled up into Crimea, there was a significant number of Karaites who are a branch of Judaism, and these people, somehow they were able to convince the Nazis that they weren't ethnically Jewish, that they were just Turks who happened to follow the Jewish religion. And in this way, some members of this community, at least, were able to protect themselves from the worst atrocities of the Holocaust. So
wow.
In this one particular instance, the Khazar...
It actually did. Well, there's one time where it actually did work. Wow, all right. Well, I'm sure those guys, I'm sure Isidore Loeb will be proud. This, I think, leads us to the not fun part of the episode, which is kind of we're going to basically have to end this on a downer note, which is that all of this medieval genealogy talk is really fun. Like, I love this stuff about Brutus, about Melusine, about the Quinotar. But the problem is that all of these discussions of genealogy, when you're especially talking about a national level, have really dangerous and unfortunate implications, because ultimately this ancient concept of dividing people into ancestral groups based on whichever son of Noah they were descended from gives us the scientific racism that would end up justifying, and I would say probably leading to some extent, the kinds of horrifying industrial slaughters like the Holocaust that we've mentioned. So racism as we know it, I think pretty clearly has its roots in colonialism more than anything else. But after racial systems of subjugation were created, science as well as scripture were used to justify them. The word Japhetic was initially used to describe Europeans as a racial group which didn't include Jews for many decades. But then by the start of the 19th century, it sort of gave way to a supposedly more scientific term, Caucasian. Something I didn't really totally understand until this episode is that, Sam, do you know why the word Caucasian is used to describe Europeans and Middle Eastern people?
Some really horny German anthropologist went to the Caucasus in like the 18th century and thought that they were the most attractive people in the world. So naturally Europeans must be descended from them.
That's like 50% of the reason. That's an important part of the reason. The other 50% is because, according to the Bible, Noah's Ark landed in the Caucasus Mountains. Therefore, the sons of Noah, most importantly Japheth, had to have disembarked somewhere in the Caucasus.
That's interesting.
And so, according to this worldview, this is the first use of the word Caucasian as a racial descriptor in the this is late 18th century Germany. They believed, basically, as previous medieval scholars had believed, that the sons of Noah, Japheth, Ham, and Shem, were the ancestors of all the different groups in that part of the world. So the sons of Japheth were European, the sons of Ham were African, and the sons of Shem, the Semites, were Middle Eastern, like Jews and Arabs. But here's kind of a problem with this theory. So according to that worldview, all of the sons of Noah would be essentially Caucasian because they left Noah's Ark in the Caucasus Mountains. But the sons of Ham were traditionally understood to be African. And so, you'd think, obviously, an African person is not Caucasian, right? Even in this worldview. Especially because 18th century slave owners often used this imaginary curse of Ham to explain why it was just perfectly fine to enslave Black people. Can you guess, Sam, how the Europeans tried to square this circle?
Not completely sure, actually.
They invented this rhetorical trick, which still kind of survives today, which said that the sons of Ham do not mean all Africans, but only the civilized Africans living in the northeast of the continent. They drew an imaginary line between peoples like Nubians and Ethiopians from the other peoples of other regions of Africa. And according to this logic, any accomplishments by dark-skinned peoples in Northeast Africa could not be considered accomplishments of any kind of Black people, but instead of dark-skinned Caucasians. And that West Africans or Central Africans or Southern Africans had nothing to be proud of. And that really anything in Egypt or Nubia was the work basically of dark-skinned Caucasians.
It's very interesting just how fluid all of these ideas are, because, although, of course, the Bible does say that Ham and his descendants are cursed because he happened to walk in on his father.
Oh yeah, he saw Noah Noah naked. Yeah.
Yeah, and so Noah did place a curse upon him, but nowhere in that does that have anything to do with skin color or anything.
No, yeah.
Yeah, no, that was a later interpolation, very much.
I think actually, I'm not sure if there's any reference to the curse being skin color until the 18th century, until slavery had already really taken root in the Atlantic world. So yeah, so that's just kind of that's a very clear example of how white supremacy as we know it is shaped in a large part by these kinds of biblical categories. Another important thing here is that the terms Semitic and Japhetic took on their own kind of racial valence. And so by the early 19th century, a few decades after the word Caucasian was first, formulated by German racialists, other scholars who studied linguistics rather than race began to link together various languages of European and some South and West Asian peoples together. We call this today the Indo-European language family. We've talked about this in a lot of different episodes. It's a really interesting topic. We've talked about the first speakers of this language, the Indo-European language, but in basically every discussion of Indo-Europeans, you kind of have to mention that this is a somewhat fraught topic due to a very unpleasant history of association with racial white supremacy, because it's easy to argue that, if our different cultures speak related languages, that we have this inherent connection, and also means that we are better than people who don't speak these languages, yada yada. But what's interesting, though, is that these languages were not called Indo-European until relatively recently. The first primary term that was used for them, around 1815, I think, developed by a Danish scholar named Rasmus Rask, was actually Japhetic. Because if Celtic and Germanic and Ironic and Slavic languages are all linked together, all of those guys, they're all different sons of Japheth. Therefore, it proves that the Bible is right, that, this guy Japheth, he really is a progenitor of all these different people. And then
very interesting.
Yeah, and then in 1876, when a similar relationship was discovered between the Semitic languages, including Semitic languages in Ethiopia, and the Egyptian language, the phrase Hamito-Semitic was coined to describe that language family, which today is called Afroasiatic. And so these language families, they exist. These are these are real groupings that exist. But when these groupings were first devised, it was with a racial language rooted in, initially, these medieval biblical genealogies, which I think is a really kind of interesting aspect of how these medieval writers, without having any intention to do so, conceived of ancestry in ways that eventually could be abused to a pretty terrifying extent to dehumanize people who were not seen as, beneficiaries of a great bloodline, whether if it's because they were lowly Slavic peasants who were not proud Sarmatians, whether it's because they were West African people who weren't even on Noah's Ark at all, who were not descended from any sons of Noah, who, according to in the minds of these white supremacists, were hardly human.
Yeah, and again, this is very much an example of an unintended consequences, because nobody who was thinking in these categories like over 2,000 years ago could have possibly imagined that this is where it would end up. I mean, it just goes to show that if you have a high verbal IQ, you can use pretty much anything to justify anything. So remember, kids, politics is all a linguistic game, and it's your job to figure out the right words to solve all the problems.
That's absolutely right. And I think it's time to finish off this episode with a little topic that I think kind of puts the entire study of genealogy in a really different light, which is something that is often called the problem of ancestry. And so this is this really kind of interesting statistical and even almost philosophical principle, which is the fact that, very simply put, everybody has a lot of different ancestors.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if you don't know about it, there's a very good chance that somewhere in your bloodline is this very great prodigal figure that you've learned about in school.
Right. And I'm going to interrupt you. I don't mean to interrupt you, Sam, but I wouldn't say very good chance. I would say basically a statistical inevitability. Because when I say you have a lot of ancestors, I mean you have a lot of ancestors. Everybody listening to this podcast is descended from so many different individual humans, once you go back far enough, that after a certain point, everybody who ever existed is your ancestor, no matter where in the world they lived. So just an example, about 500 years ago, that's about 15 generations. For a lot of us, that's like, that'll be like the era of like the Tudors. Like, so oh, here's an example. When I was doing my family tree, I saw that one of the people I'm descended from, supposedly, is Mary Boleyn, Sister Van Boleyn. Like, that's kind of cool, right? Like, it's a figure I've read about in books like Wolf Hall. I just saw that show. Yeah, it's awesome. But here's the thing. Basically, anybody with English ancestry is probably going to be descended from Mary Boleyn, or at least there's a very good chance, or at least they're descended from her grandparents, because Mary Boleyn is 15 generations back. Every person has more than 65,000 15th generation ancestors. That is a lot of people. And because with every generation, your number of ancestors grows.
Yeah, so we crunched the numbers on this, and if you assume that nobody in your family tree is related to anyone else, so I mean, granted, the real world numbers are going to be somewhat smaller.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of duplicates. Yeah.
Yeah, but nevertheless, if you just go by that,
and if you come from royalty, there's a lot more duplicates than.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so if you go by those metrics, then 15 generations back, you're going to have over 65,000 ancestors, like people you're directly related to, descended from. And basically, with every generation, that number just doubles. So when you get to the 16th generation ancestors, you're up to 131,000 people. And these numbers just get crazier the further back you go, Liam. You figured out that if you go back 1,000 years, which is around 30 generations, you're going to have 1 billion ancestors, which is...
Yes. Which is, and so in the year 1000, there were not 1 billion people on Earth. There were like 400 million people. So it just means that around the year 1000, most likely either every single human is in your family tree, or many people are just in your family tree many, many more times.
Yeah, and that's just nuts to think about. I mean, I understand on an abstract level, I understand that all humans alive today are the descendants of a woman named mitochondrial Eve, who lived something like 50,000 years ago, I believe. But just like reckoning with the scale of how many ancestors we have is just wow, yeah.
Oh yeah. No, it's crazy. There's a paper published by MIT. This is a 2004 statistical modeling model, which was the first to really put the numbers to this. And so this one, led by a scholar named Douglas Rode, suggested that the most recent common ancestor of humans lived at the very earliest. The most recent common ancestor of all humans lived 1400 BC, around the time of Queen Nefertiti of Egypt. So basically what this means is that every single person who lived before 1400 BC, no matter where in the world they lived, whether they were in China, whether they were in the Americas, whether they were in Europe, all of their living descendants are now among the descendants of modern day peoples, because ancestry travels indirectly very, very fast, much faster than we'd expect. If one Italian person who has Middle Eastern ancestry moves to England, then within a few generations, every single person in England would share that Middle Eastern ancestry. We are all a lot more related than you might think. And okay, listeners might be asking, okay, you guys have been talking for 2 hours. Why is this relevant here? Why is this last little part relevant to the previous stories about ancestry? And that's because this sounds like kind of, like basic hippie stuff, but it's true. We are very closely related to each other. Humans have a lot of links in blood, especially when we're talking about ancestry. We all have way more ancestors than we can fit in any of our genomes. So the idea that ancestors are important to who we are in any kind of genetic sense, more than any kind of cultural sense, it's total bullshit.
And you know what else it means? Mm-hmm. It means that all of our listeners are our cousins.
That's right. And that's why we hope that on this, Thanksgiving week, all of our extended Gladio Free Europe family had a happy and thankful Thanksgiving. We're wishing all of this to our cousins. And we want everyone listening to understand that whenever anyone talks about, like a certain group being descended by whatever ancient tribe, it's bullshit in the sense that everybody else in the region, possibly everybody in the world, is also descended from that group. This is a thing that comes up a lot in modern day, right-wing circles with modern day racists, but it doesn't mean anything. If anyone has a fight about like who the real descendants of the Egyptians are, or the ancient Hebrews or whatever, the answer is basically everybody, even people in Korea, even people in, the Amazon rainforest. That's how human ancestry works. It's really hard to wrap your head around it, but those are the numbers. And I think that just kind of puts all kinds of ancestral claims in really different lights. And it makes you realize that, all of this stuff is just such a goofy thing to argue about.
So again, it's a goofy thing to argue about. It's something that you talk about with your friends to shoot the shit, have some fun, make some quite ethnic jokes about Italians, things of that nature. But if you see anyone taking this stuff too seriously, just ignore them.
Right. Yeah. That's why. So if anyone here is like a genealogical hobbyist, you guys should go for it. Just don't put too much stock into any of that ancestral stuff, and also, and whether it's the genetic percentages, that's all not super accurate, or whether it's like saying you are descended from whoever person, but you should still have fun with it. Because you never know, you might look back far enough in your family tree and you see that you in fact are the great grandson of Melusine, the snake woman. And I guess on that note, I think that wraps up this week's episode. Sam, good to know that you or I are cousins. I guess we should never get married.
Yeah, Gladio Free Europe is the only podcast that takes the logic of never marrying your cousin to its logical conclusion.
That's right. You must never marry anyone. That's right, because we are all cousins after all. And that's why on this lovely Thanksgiving week, we offer our entire extended Gladio Free family a very lovely and relaxing Thanksgiving. This has been Gladio Free Europe signing off.
Bye-bye.